Hey there, folks. As you know, I often on this program speak to Rod Martin, also known as Rod D. Martin, about what's going on. And I am very happy to have him as my guest today to try to process what's going on. Rod Martin, welcome back.
Great to be here.
Maybe we should first talk about the attempt on President Trump's life, since that's the headline news, as unfortunately it must be.
Well, there's no question that this is just horrifying. And I was so gratified to hear what the president had to say about even senior Democrats coming up to him in the room and hugging him and offering support. And that's how things ought to be. We should be one people that is horrified by any kind of political violence whatsoever. The problem is we aren't. And there was some really fascinating polling on this in September by YouGov that found that 26% of young male Democrats, so 45 and younger, 26%, more than a fourth, believe political violence is justified. And that was the word used, justified. Now, this is not a both sides problem. The conservative number was 7%, not 27, not 26, 7. Now, 7 should horrify us. We should be absolutely horrified that 7% of anybody thinks we ought to have political violence to advance a political agenda. But 7 is a quarter of the Democrat number, which is a quarter of them all. So this is where we are. This is almost Civil War kind of territory.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with it. And you know where it's coming from. It's coming from the same critical theory we've been talking about now for a long time. This Marxist rebranding that defines certain groups of people as incapable of wrong and other groups of people as irredeemable and deplorable. And, Hillary didn't use those words lightly or accidentally. It's actually the mindset of critical theory, which is just a rebranding of Marxism. They talk about oppressors and oppressed. The classical Marxists talked about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but the analysis was identical. And the ultimate result of that is you have a lot of people who grew up in a public school and a public education system. This shooter was a Caltech graduate and a teacher. He's not some crazy guy. He's a mainstream Kamala Harris donor who goes to No Kings rallies and goes and shoots the president. And that's where a lot of these people are. So until you deal with the schools, until you deal with the critical theory indoctrination, instead of what we all were raised to believe was important, critical thinking, where you actually look at the facts, you actually have the discussion, you actually do the kinds of things you've been doing your whole career, Eric, until you actually bring that back as the cultural norm, this is only going to get worse.
Well, we have to really explain, why is it wrong to say, because it's one thing for us to tut and of course, obviously I agree with you, but to explain the issue, because I think there are people that either they're sloppy thinkers or they've picked things up, and I can understand where people are coming from. For example, when I talk about Bonhoeffer, I've spoken about Bonhoeffer for 16 years giving speeches, and I always get the question: how can a man of God be involved in a plot to murder the head of state? And this is where you have to explain. You say, ladies and gentlemen, listen, this is complicated. First of all, it's not murder. If it's murder, it's a sin. Killing is not always murder. Okay, when we took out Osama bin Laden, or when David killed Goliath, it's not murder, it's killing. So we have to really try to understand when is violence acceptable and when isn't it. So when we go to war, there's violence involved, but that is different from what we're talking about here. And we really have to, in a sense, educate the culture on what are we actually talking about? Because I think there are people, and you know this, Rod, there are a lot of people out there that are convinced Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. And if I were alive and I could get involved in the plot to kill Hitler, I would kill Hitler. They really haven't thought it through. And they're convinced that because he's Hitler, we have an obligation to do something. We've got to stop him. Hitler has taken over the democratic process. He's the enemy of democracy. So they really do feel like it's justified because he's Hitler. And so, first of all, I think we have to explain that, even if it is Hitler, what is justified and what's not justified, because Bonhoeffer was not like, hey, it's Hitler, we got to kill him.
Run.
It's a little more complicated than that. But I think that there are people that feel a level of desperation because they are convinced genuinely that Trump is a threat to everything. They really believe that. And so I guess we have to talk about why we believe that it's not okay to take a gun and try to kill your enemies in this way. And I guess part of the calculus is they have run out of the ability to persuade. In other words, they've come to a point where they're frustrated because their efforts at persuasion are failing. Their efforts at the ballot box are failing. And so I think in that frustration, they say, well, we've got to resort to violence because people aren't listening, as though they actually had arguments, which alas, they do not.
Well, yes. And coming back to a key point you were making there. Yes, lots of these people believe Donald Trump is literally Hitler. But you can only get there if you're programmed to think that by a relentless narrative going back as long as I can remember. They were doing this to Bush, too. They were doing this to Reagan. They weren't doing it with the same intensity yet. However, you'll recall in 2008, there was that picture of John McCain as this blood-smeared Dracula figure. There's been this demonization and dehumanization of people on the right for as long as I can remember. And it's worse than that. I wouldn't consider John McCain to be a particularly right-wing figure. George W. Bush is not some hardcore conservative guy. And yet they were literally Hitler too, just not with the same intensity. Now, Trump is just horrifying because he's really going after the centers of the left's power. He has actually gotten rid of 139 federal regulations for every one new one. He has actually given us the biggest tax cut in the history of the federal government. He has actually reduced federal power in meaningful ways, and his Justice Department has argued cases before the Supreme Court that dramatically roll back the state that FDR and the Democrats created for most of a century. So they feel incredibly threatened, whether you're talking about deep staters or their friends in the teachers' unions or whatever you're talking about. And so he is an existential threat, not to democracy, but very much to what they call our democracy, which just means ruled by Democrats. And look, there were a couple of Bernie staffers a couple campaigns ago who got caught planning concentration camps for people like you and me. And Bernie didn't even fire them. I mean, this is just how they operate. This is how they think. And if you think that they are cheering for the killing of Donald Trump, just imagine these same young Democrat men who think political violence is justified. Imagine these guys in 10 or 20 years in positions of authority. They are going to be brutally totalitarian, and they make no bones about it.
Well, again, this is why I feel that we need to educate the culture, and it's something you're doing every day. I'm trying to do it every day. I'm trying to do it in writing my book on the revolution. Everybody needs to understand what we have in America, the founders' vision, people governing themselves, how you get that, how you lose it. Because if you don't have that, people drift toward cultural Marxism, toward socialism, toward all the things that we're seeing young people drift toward because they don't know the basics. They don't know what the rules are, what makes a people flourish. They haven't been taught that in school. The culture hasn't been teaching that. So it's one of my crusades that I'm on, is that if you really understand what it is that we have and how our government works, what a blessing it is, what a blessing it is to everybody. If you actually understand that, you won't drift in these directions. But we have hosts of young people, especially, but older people, who they've really lost touch with the basics. They're angry. In any event, we'll be right back trying to solve these problems with Rod Martin. Don't go away. Welcome back, talking to Rod Martin. So, Rod, we're talking about political violence in America, and I think that, to restate what we were saying before, the left, you talk about they've lost their way. I mean, we're not dealing with Bill Clinton.
No.
We're dealing with Marxist lunatics, people that basically hate America. It really started with Obama, who wants to fundamentally transform America, and who imported critical race theory and that kind of Marxist thinking into the mainstream of American life. And it is pernicious, and it has been doing its work. And the logical result of that is political violence on the left.
Yes. And there's no escaping that left-wing political philosophy has always been an inherently violent thing. It glorifies and exalts violence as the tool for needed social change. So that's just anathema to the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview, from which the American Revolution sprang, is all about persuasion. And the reason it is because it asserts that man is made in the image of God, and you don't have the right to kill an image bearer unless there is a really distinct circumstance, such as actual war, execution of a murderer, something that actually would justify this, usually with some measure of due process. But you never use that as a substitute for persuasion, because we believe that everyone is equal. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These things being the case, then I don't get to compel you to do things my way. I get to persuade you. And then we have an election every couple years or 4 years or 6, depending on the office. And we basically take a head count of who was most persuasive. And that is the basis of ordered liberty, which is what the founders wanted. Ordered liberty, where my rights end where yours begin, and I have to treat you with dignity no matter what. Now, that doesn't mean we have to get along. That doesn't mean we can't yell at each other. That doesn't mean that we have to be buddies. It does mean that there is a line you cannot cross. And Marxism asserts that you must cross it. And so these worldviews are not compatible. And the Marxist worldview, the socialist or even democratic socialist worldview, is one that is seeking to annihilate that Christian and in application American way of looking at the world. It's essential that people read the book you are writing on the revolution. That is going to be a godsend in this hour. It's also essential that people read Cole Allen's manifesto, which is just manifestly anti-Christian. These are the worldviews in conflict, and make no mistake, there can only be one winner.
Thank you for referencing my new book, Revolution, because I was just going to say that when you bring up, violence, when is violence acceptable? And then you mentioned the revolution. And what I discovered in my research, and it's obviously in my book, is that the revolutionaries, the Americans, did not want violence. They were committed never to fire the first shot. They were committed only to defend themselves. And this is a big deal, folks. This is the biblical view. This is, just war theory that we don't just say, well, it's right and we're going to use guns to win. We come at it defensively. We say that, if the war begins, we will not cower. We will defend ourselves. But that commitment on the part of the leaders of the American Revolution to have the moral high ground, not to stoop to the level of the British, who would do anything to win, who would treat their prisoners despicably, who would bayonet and kill people, young men who were surrendering, that kind of thing. They would stoop to that. Our side, Washington and others, were very strict and stern in saying, we will never stoop to that. We have standards. So yes, we will defend ourselves, but we have to have the moral high ground. It's very important that we understand these things, folks. Otherwise, violence becomes increasingly acceptable. And I think that the Christian quality of the American Revolution, of the Americans fighting in the American Revolution, I didn't know, Rod, as I went into my research, that I would find this. I simply didn't know it, but it became clearer and clearer to me that that most of the leaders, or at least those who were the leaders, Washington and others, they were determined that we would fight in a certain way, only in this way. And if God blesses us, God blesses us, but we're not going to stoop. We'll be right back talking to Rod Martin. Welcome back. I'm talking to Rod Martin. We're talking about a lot of things, including the political violence recently, the attempt to murder President Trump and members of his cabinet. And I guess I'm wondering what the cognoscenti are making of this. When President Trump was interviewed by Norah O'Donnell, I guess it was on 60 Minutes, it's so clear that the left feels that they have an obligation, and Norah O'Donnell felt an obligation to kind of give the other side its say. And so she quotes the manifesto of this murderous lunatic. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that he did what he did, but then he writes this thing out accusing the president of being a pedophile. Ladies and gentlemen, have you heard this? A rapist. And you think, I guess, does he really believe that President Trump is a pedophile? It's just so crazy, but it's even crazier that, one of the head figures at CBS News decides that she needs to quote this to the president's face.
This is part of that dehumanization and just delegitimization, not just of Trump, but of conservatives generally, because the next part of that same criticism is, well, you voted for a rapist pedophile, so you are a rapist pedophile and you must be killed too. Okay, well, how many of us do you want to kill? And we actually have an answer for that, because Gus Hall, who was the longtime general secretary of the Communist Party USA, was asked that in an interview decades ago. And he said, oh, no, we wouldn't engage in purges like Stalin. In America, we wouldn't have to kill more than about a third of the population. Well, okay, once you imbibe of that Marxist mindset, that's where you are. Whether you're a National Socialist like Hitler, who kills 10 million of his own people, 6 million of them Jews, 4 million others, or you're Stalin and you kill 20 million of your own people, or you're Mao and you kill 65 million of your own people, or Pol Pot and you kill a third of your population in under 3 years. All of these things have this constant thread, the permanent revolution, which is always soaked in blood. And it's no different from the French Revolution, except in degree. So again, that's the worldview we're talking about. Now, Norah O'Donnell wants to give credence to both sides. I would ask how much time she would think was appropriate for us to give both sides of the JFK assassination, or the Martin Luther King assassination, or any other assassination of someone that they care about. They
Well,
don't
she did. I
care
mean, look,
about.
she didn't put it that way, but effectively, I
That's
mean, by
effectively what
reading
she's
the
doing. Yeah.
manifesto, you're thinking you're giving airtime to the devil. I mean, you're really doing something that is generally not in the best interest of the nation. And that's when Trump said, you're despicable or something like that. And I thought this is why Trump is such a great man, because he will say that he
Yeah.
doesn't let it go, but he will throw it right back at her. What you're doing is despicable. You should be ashamed of yourself, and she should be ashamed of herself
Yes.
to publicize that kind of thing. To say, well, what do you think about that? Because again, we've seen this in our lives where people say, well, we want to show both sides of the story, but it's really not fair, because sometimes when you say you're showing both sides of the story, you're not really showing both sides of the story. There are
No.
certain things that are better left unsaid. And that's always a judgment call. But I was so glad that the president threw it back at her.
Well, and he should have. Absolutely. The double standard is extraordinary. And, if we're just talking about regular politics, no big deal. Politics is a contact sport. It's not supposed to involve contact with bullets. And that's where we are now. They murdered Charlie. They've tried to murder Trump at least 3 times that we know of. And there's just no end to this. They're not going to stop coming. I mean, if this man survives his second term, it'll be a miracle of God. It already has been. So you can't function in that kind of environment. And what they're trying to do, and Yuri Bezmenov talked about this in that famous interview in 1984. He was a top KGB defector, and he came over and he said, look, you have this demoralization process where you teach an entire generation through the schools that everything they are told to believe is good is actually terrible. And they're victims, and they can never be anything but victims, and they've just got to kill their oppressors. So you have that demoralization stage, but you also have this programming where whatever the narrative is true. And you don't analyze facts that aren't fed to you. 2 + 2 really does equal whatever the party tells you, and that will change from day to day.
We'll be right back talking to Rod Martin. Welcome back, talking to Rod Martin, whom you can find at the Rod Martin Report. Highly recommended, folks. Okay, Rod, Iran. It's amazing how news changes. Suddenly, we're talking about the attack on the president's life, but 5 minutes ago, we were talking about Iran. You have been really sanguine, hopeful about where you think it goes ultimately, and whether the son of the Shah will be able to come in there, whether we will have real regime change. I know that doesn't happen overnight, but what is your sense of where this is going from here?
I think the regime is on the brink here. Now, how long can they hold on? I don't know. I mean, the American Civil War took 4 years. World War II took 6 years. 3 with the Americans involved, 3 without. These things take time, and Americans are used to a 2-hour movie and a happy ending. And so you just have some absurd statements coming out of people on both left and right about how long this is taking. This hasn't taken any time at all. And the truth is, what we've done with the blockade is actually more damaging to the regime than what we did in the military campaign. They are losing approximately $430 million a day. That's $430 million a day because of the blockade. 80% of their state revenues come from the export of energy. And we have pretty well shut that off. And every now and then you'll see some leftist or never Trumper on X or somewhere talking about, oh, well, some ships slipped through. Okay, well, that's fine. Let's say 20% of the ships slipped through. If you had an 80% pay cut tomorrow, could you pay your mortgage? Would you make your car payment? I mean, at some point, this really bites into them. And here's the thing, I was talking to Frank Gaffney about this, and Frank is awesome, and everybody should watch his show. But he was very concerned. These Islamic Revolutionary Guard guys are extremely hardcore. They're extremely ideological. What? How do you deal with that? Do you kill them all? And my answer is, in part, at some point, if they aren't getting paid, if their basic necessities aren't being met, they may not question their ideology, but they will question their leaders. They will question the judgment of the people above them. And that's your wedge in, because at some point, everybody realizes that Iran is really in a world of hurt. And a lot of the reason is that $500 billion of national treasure has gone into digging out huge bunkers under mountains and nuclear bombs to blow up the world. And most Iranians don't agree with any of that. So if you get to a point where there are enough cracks in the regime, the people absolutely can rise. I don't doubt that we are getting weapons in position. Reza Pahlavi keeps talking about his immortal guards in Iran, just waiting for the signal. I think we get there. I think we've got a very good chance, not 100%. I think we've got a very good chance of a free and prosperous Iran that becomes a top U.S. ally and a beacon of liberty and prosperity to its entire region.
And just to be clear, Reza Pahlavi is the son of the Shah. Reza Pahlavi is now in his 60s. I'd not heard that term before, his immortal guards. In other words, he is saying that there are folks in Iran who are on his side, sort of waiting. Obviously, so many of them have been slaughtered by the regime, the current regime. But there is some sense that there are folks inside Iran who are, I guess, biding their time for when they would strike.
Oh, absolutely. Look, Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, the soon-to-be Shah, sent out word in January. Look, hold fire. Keep your powder dry. We want you to wait until we send the signal and then rise. And Trump said something very similar around the same time. And then this was all reiterated right after the war began. It's like, look, the bombs are going to be raining down. We don't want you out in the street getting killed. That's not going to be helpful. Let the military campaign do its work. Well, it has done a lot of its work. And we saw leading into the ceasefire 2.5 weeks of targeted drone strikes on individual Basij and IRGC thugs in the streets who are there to put up checkpoints and honestly murder anybody who looks like they might be a protester or might in any way resist. Unarmed is irrelevant. In fact, unarmed is better from their point of view. And it's important to understand there were millions of Iranians in the streets protesting this regime in January, and the regime mowed down with gunfire 42,000 of them, almost as many people as died in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, murdered by the Iranian regime in the streets of Iran in 2 days in January. No, the Shah does not want his people slaughtered like that. The president doesn't want the Iranian people slaughtered like that. They want to get to a point where either the regime negotiates its exit or it cracks enough that an overthrow is actually possible from within. But one thing you can be sure of, Donald Trump said from the beginning that as much as we might like regime change, the boots on the ground will have to be the Iranian people. We're not going to do some big ground invasion like Iraq. And so we are counting on that. That might not happen. But the last time Reza Pahlavi told his people to rise and go out into the streets, they went en masse. And that was after thousands of them had been murdered. So I think they are waiting for his command, and I think he will give it at the right moment. And my hope for this, I'm not a monarchist, so don't misunderstand me. But I just want to spell out the hope. In Spain, after Francisco Franco was dictator for the better part of the 20th century, King Juan Carlos took over. Franco had set this up, and Juan Carlos could have done anything he wanted. He could have been a dictator. He could have been, he could have stepped down. What he did was he carried out a transition government for a couple years in which they established a constitutional monarchy like Great Britain's, which is functionally a democracy like the United States. That's what Reza Pahlavi has committed to for decades, and I think that's what would happen, and we're very hopeful and prayerful toward that.
Where has Reza Pahlavi been living all these years? I mean, I remember when the Shah left Iran in 1979. Where has his son been living?
Well, these days, the Pahlavis are as American as apple pie. The Crown Prince, of course, has a residence in the D.C. area. His daughter, the Crown Princess. So if Reza Pahlavi had a heart attack tomorrow, or if that guy who threw paint at him in Europe the other day had a knife instead, the next person in line to the throne is his elder daughter. She's actually a venture capitalist in New York. She grew up here. She went to American schools. Actually, Reza Pahlavi mostly went to American schools also. So these people have had decades living in the United States, seeing how a free society works, seeing the prosperity and peace that comes from that. They want it for Iran. We could not ask for a better outcome.
Well, it's just an amazing thing that we are really living through history right now. There's just no way around it. These are quote unquote interesting times. I don't know who said that about, may you live in interesting times. These are historic. It's an historic moment. I guess what fascinates me, Rod, is how the left seems to be pushing the narrative that this is a waste of time and money and the Iranians are winning. It seems just like pure craziness and wishful thinking on their part.
It's very much like saying the South is winning the Civil War after the fall of Atlanta. I mean, it's just nonsense. But if you'll recall, Democrats said that too. Democrats ran in the 1864 election against Abraham Lincoln on a platform of letting the South go free with its slaves. The war is basically won at that point, and they're still working with their Democrat allies in the South. So what else is new? Here you have the military forces of this country just decimated. You have the regime on the ropes. Everything has gone badly for them. They haven't been able to do any of the things they said. They're touting being able to shoot down one American fighter. Well, okay. That was at the end of 20,000 sorties over Iran. They managed to get one, and that's a victory. Iran is winning. No, some speedboats are able to harass some shipping. That's not a victory. It's a joke. And so yes, there is this very clear sense that the same kinds of Democrats represented by Cole Allen would rather see Iran win if Trump can lose.
Rod Martin, always a joy to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.